Chapter 42 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Chapter 42. Confidential and Accidental. Attired no more in Captain Cuttle's sable slops and sou'wester hat, but dressed in a substantial suit of brown livery, which, while it affected to be a very sober and demure livery indeed, was really as self-satisfied and confident a one as tailor need desire to make, Rob the grinder, thus transformed as to his outer man, and all regardless within of the captain and the midshipmen, except when he devoted a few minutes of his leisure time to crowing over those inseparable worthies, and recalling, with much applauding music from that brazen instrument his conscience, the triumphant manner in which he had disembarrassed himself of their company, now served his patron, Mr. Carker. Inmate of Mr. Carker's house, and serving about his person, Rob kept his round eyes on the white teeth with fear and trembling, and felt that he had need to open them wider than ever. He could not have quaked more, through his whole being, before the teeth, though he had come into the service of some powerful enchanter, and they had been his strongest spell. The boy had a sense of power and authority in this patron of his that engrossed his whole attention and exacted his most implicit submission and obedience. He hardly considered himself safe in thinking about him when he was absent, lest he should feel himself immediately taken by the throat again, as on the morning when he first became bound to him, and should see every one of the teeth finding him out, and taxing him with every fancy of his mind. Face to face with him, Rob had no more doubt that Mr. Carker read his secret thoughts, or that he could read them by the least exertion of his will, if he were so inclined, than he had that Mr. Carker saw him when he looked at him. The ascendancy was so complete and held him in such enthralment that, hardly daring to think at all, but with his mind filled with a constantly dilating impression of his patron's irresistible command over him, and power of doing anything with him, he would stand watching his pleasure and trying to anticipate his orders in a state of mental suspension as to all other things. Rob had not informed himself, perhaps. In his then state of mind, it would have been an act of no common temerity to inquire whether he yielded so completely to this influence in any part, because he had floating suspicions of his patron's being a master of certain treacherous arts in which he had himself been a poor scholar at the grinder's school. But certainly Rob admired him, as well as feared him. Mr. Carker, perhaps, was better acquainted with the sources of his power, which lost nothing by his management of it. On the very night when he left the captain's service, Rob, after disposing of his pigeons, and even making a bad bargain in his hurry, had gone straight down to Mr. Carker's house, and hotly presented himself before his new master with a glowing face that seemed to expect commendation. "What scapegrace!" said Mr. Carker, glancing at his bundle. "Have you left your situation and come to me?" "Oh, if you please, sir," faltered Rob. "You said, you know, when I come here last—" "I said," returned Mr. Carker. "What did I say?" "If you please, sir, you didn't say nothing at all, sir," returned Rob, warned by the manner of this inquiry, and very much disconcerted. His patron looked at him with a wide display of gums, and shaking his forefinger, observed, "You'll come to an evil end, my vagabond friend, I foresee. There's ruin in store for you." "Oh, if you please, don't, sir," cried Rob, with his legs trembling under him. "I'm sure, sir, I only want to work for you, sir, and to wait upon you, sir, and to do faithful whatever I'm bid, sir." "You had better do faithfully whatever you are bid," returned his patron, "if you have anything to do with me." "Yes, I know that, sir," pleaded the submissive Rob. "I'm sure of that, sir. If you'll only be so good as try me, sir. And if ever you find me out, sir, doing anything against your wishes, I give you leave to kill me." "You dog!" said Mr. Carker, leaning back in his chair and smiling at him serenely. "That's nothing to what I'd do to you if you tried to deceive me." "Yes, sir," replied the abject Grinder. "I'm sure you would be down upon me dreadful, sir. I wouldn't attempt to go and do it, sir, not if I was bribed with golden guineas." Thoroughly checked in his expectations of commendation, the crestfallen Grinder stood looking at his patron, and vainly endeavouring not to look at him, with the uneasiness which a cur will often manifest in a similar situation. "So you have left your old service, and come here to ask me to take you into mine, eh?" said Mr. Carker. "Yes, if you please, sir," returned Rob, who, in doing so, had acted on his patron's own instructions, but dared not justify himself by the least insinuation to that effect. "Well," said Mr. Carker, "you know me, boy?" "Please, sir, yes," returned Rob, fumbling with his hat, and still fixed by Mr. Carker's eye, and fruitlessly endeavouring to unfix himself. Mr. Carker nodded. "Take care, then." Rob expressed in a number of short bows his lively understanding of this caution, and was bowing himself back to the door, greatly relieved by the prospect of getting on the outside of it, when his patron stopped him. "Hullo!" he cried, calling him roughly back. "You have been... Shut that door!" Rob obeyed as if his life had depended on his alacrity. "You have been used to eavesdropping. Do you know what that means?" "Listening, sir," Rob hazarded, after some embarrassed reflection. His patron nodded. "And watching, and so forth." "I wouldn't do such a thing here, sir," answered Rob. "Upon my word and honour, I wouldn't, sir. I wish I may die if I would, sir, for anything that could be promised to me. I should consider it as much as all the world was worth to offer to do such a thing, unless I was ordered, sir." "You had better not. You have been used, too, to babbling and tattling," said his patron with perfect coolness. "Beware of that here, or you're a lost rascal." And he smiled again, and again cautioned him with his forefinger. The Grinder's breath came short and thick with consternation. He tried to protest the purity of his intentions, but could only stare at the smiling gentleman in a stupor of submission, with which the smiling gentleman seemed well enough satisfied, for he ordered him downstairs, after observing him for some moments in silence, and gave him to understand that he was retained in his employment. This was the manner of Rob the Grinder's engagement by Mr. Carker, and his awe-stricken devotion to that gentleman had strengthened and increased, if possible, with every minute of his service. It was a service of some months' duration, when early one morning Rob opened the garden gate to Mr. Dombey, who was come to breakfast with his master by appointment. At the same moment his master himself came, hurrying forth to receive the distinguished guest, and give him welcome with all his teeth. "I never thought," said Carker, when he had assisted him to alight from his horse, "to see you here, I'm sure. This is an extraordinary day in my calendar. No occasion is very special to a man like you, who may do anything, but to a man like me the case is widely different." "You have a tasteful place here, Carker," said Mr. Dombey, condescending to stoop upon the lawn to look about him. "You can afford to say so," returned Carker. "Thank you." "Indeed," said Mr. Dombey, in his lofty patronage, "any one might say so. As far as it goes, it is a very commodious and well-arranged place, quite elegant." "As far as it goes, truly," returned Carker, with an air of disparagement. "It wants that qualification. Well, we have said enough about it, and though you can afford to praise it, I thank you none the less. Will you walk in?" Mr. Dombey, entering the house, noticed, as he had reason to do, the complete arrangement of the rooms, and the numerous contrivances for comfort and effect that abounded there. Mr. Carker, in his ostentation of humility, received this notice with a deferential smile, and said he understood its delicate meaning, and appreciated it, but in truth the cottage was good enough for one in his position, better, perhaps, than such a man should occupy, poor as it was. "But perhaps to you, who are so far removed, it really does look better than it is," he said, with his false mouth distended to its fullest stretch, just as monarchs imagine attractions in the lives of beggars. He directed a sharp glance and a sharp smile at Mr. Dombey as he spoke, and a sharper glance and a sharper smile yet when Mr. Dombey, drawing himself up before the fire, in the attitude so often copied by his second in command, looked round at the pictures on the walls. Cursorily, as his cold eye wandered over them, Carker's keen glance accompanied his, and kept pace with his, marking exactly where it went and what it saw. As it rested on one picture in particular, Carker hardly seemed to breathe, his sidelong scrutiny was so cat-like and vigilant, but the eye of his great chief passed from that, as from the others, and appeared no more impressed by it than by the rest. Carker looked at it. It was the picture that resembled Edith, as if it were a living thing, and with a wicked, silent laugh upon his face, that seemed in part addressed to it, though it was all derisive of the great man standing so unconscious beside him. Breakfast was soon set upon the table, and, inviting Mr. Dombey to a chair which had its back towards this picture, he took his own seat opposite to it as usual. Mr. Dombey was even graver than it was his custom to be, and quite silent. The parrot, swinging in the gilded hoop within her gaudy cage, attempted in vain to attract notice, for Carker was too observant of his visitor to heed her, and the visitor, abstracted in meditation, looked fixedly, not to say sullenly, over his stiff neckcloth, without raising his eyes from the tablecloth. As to Rob, who was in attendance, all his faculties and energies were so locked up in observation of his master that he scarcely ventured to give shelter to the thought that the visitor was the great gentleman before whom he had been carried as a certificate of the family health, in his childhood, and to whom he had been indebted for his leather smalls. "Allow me," said Carker suddenly, "to ask how Mrs. Dombey is." He leaned forward obsequiously as he made the inquiry, with his chin resting on his hand, and at the same time his eyes went up to the picture, as if he said to it, "Now see how I will lead him on." Mr. Dombey reddened as he answered, "Mrs. Dombey is quite well. You remind me, Carker, of some conversation that I wish to have with you." "Robin, you can leave us," said his master, at whose mild tones Robin started and disappeared, with his eyes fixed on his patron to the last. "You don't remember that boy, of course," he added, when the enmeshed grinder was gone. "No," said Mr. Dombey, with magnificent indifference. "Not likely that a man like you would. Hardly possible," murmured Carker. "But he is one of that family from whom you took a nurse. Perhaps you may remember having generously charged yourself with his education." "Is it that boy?" said Mr. Dombey, with a frown. "He does little credit to his education, I believe." "Why, he is a young rip, I am afraid," returned Carker, with a shrug. "He bears that character. But the truth is, I took him into my service because, being able to get no other employment, he conceived had been taught at home, I dare say, that he had some sort of claim upon you, and was constantly trying to dog your heels with his petition. And although my defined and recognised connection with your affairs is merely of a business character, still I have that spontaneous interest in everything belonging to you that—" He stopped again, as if to discover whether he had led Mr. Dombey far enough yet, and again, with his chin resting on his hand, he leered at the picture. "Carker," said Mr. Dombey, "I am sensible that you do not limit your—" "Service," suggested his smiling entertainer. "No, I prefer to say your regard," observed Mr. Dombey, very sensible, as he said so, that he was paying him a handsome and flattering compliment, "to our mere business relations. Your consideration for my feelings, hopes, and disappointments, in the little instance you have just now mentioned, is an example in point. I am obliged to you, Carker." Mr. Carker bent his head slowly, and very softly rubbed his hands, as if he were afraid by any action to disturb the current of Mr. Dombey's confidence. "Your allusion to it is opportune," said Mr. Dombey, after a little hesitation, "for it prepares the way to what I was beginning to say to you, and reminds me that although it involves no absolutely new relations between us, although it may involve more personal confidence on my part than I have hitherto—" "Distinguished me with," suggested Carker, bending his head again. "I will not say to you how honoured I am, for a man like you well knows how much honour he has in his power to bestow at pleasure. Mrs. Dombey and myself," said Mr. Dombey, passing this compliment with august self-denial, "are not quite agreed upon some points. We do not appear to understand each other yet. Mrs. Dombey has something to learn." "Mrs. Dombey is distinguished by many rare attractions, and has been accustomed, no doubt, to receive much adulation," said the smooth, sleek watcher of his slightest look and tone. "But where there is affection, duty, and respect, any little mistakes engendered by such causes are soon set right." Mr. Dombey's thoughts instinctively flew back to the face that had looked at him in his wife's dressing-room, when an imperious hand was stretched towards the door, and remembering the affection, duty, and respect expressed in it, he felt the blood rush to his own face quite as plainly as the watchful eyes upon him saw it there. "Mrs. Dombey and myself," he went on to say, "had some discussion, before Mrs. Skewton's death, upon the causes of my dissatisfaction, of which you will have formed a general understanding from having been a witness of what passed between Mrs. Dombey and myself on the evening when you were at my house." "When I so much regretted being present," said the smiling Carker, "proud as a man in my position necessarily must be of your familiar notice, though I give you no credit for it. You may do anything you please without losing caste, and honoured as I was by an early presentation to Mrs. Dombey, before she was made eminent by bearing your name, I almost regretted that night, I assure you, that I had been the object of such especial good fortune. That any man could, under any possible circumstances, regret the being distinguished by this condescension and patronage, was a moral phenomenon which Mr. Dombey could not comprehend. He therefore responded with a considerable accession of dignity. "Indeed, and why, Carker?" "I fear," returned the confidential agent, "that Mrs. Dombey, never very much disposed to regard me with favourable interest, one in my position could not expect that from a lady naturally proud, and whose pride becomes her so well, may not easily forgive my innocent part in that conversation. Your displeasure is no light matter, you must remember, and to be visited with it before a third party—" "Carker," said Mr. Dombey arrogantly, "I presume that I am the first consideration." "Oh, can there be a doubt about it?" replied the other, with the impatience of a man admitting a notorious and incontrovertible fact. "Mrs. Dombey becomes a secondary consideration when we are both in question, I imagine," said Mr. Dombey. "Is that so?" "Is it so?" returned Carker. "Do you know better than anyone that you have no need to ask?" "Then I hope, Carker," said Mr. Dombey, "that your regret in the acquisition of Mrs. Dombey's displeasure may be almost counterbalanced by your satisfaction in retaining my confidence and good opinion." "I have the misfortune, I find," returned Carker, "to have incurred that displeasure. Mrs. Dombey has expressed it to you?" "Mrs. Dombey has expressed various opinions," said Mr. Dombey, with majestic coldness and indifference, "in which I do not participate, and which I am not inclined to discuss or recall. I made Mrs. Dombey acquainted some time since, as I have already told you, of domestic deference and submission on which I felt it necessary to insist. I failed to convince Mrs. Dombey of the expediency of her immediately altering her conduct in those respects, with a view to her own peace and welfare, and my dignity; and I informed Mrs. Dombey that if I should find it necessary to object or remonstrate again, I should express my opinion to her through yourself, my confidential agent." Blended with the look that Carker bent upon him was a devilish look at the picture over his head that struck upon it like a flash of lightning. "Now, Carker," said Mr. Dombey, "I do not hesitate to say to you that I will carry my point. I am not to be trifled with. Mrs. Dombey must understand that my will is law, and that I cannot allow of one exception to the whole rule of my life. You will have the goodness to undertake this charge, which, coming from me, is not unacceptable to you, I hope, whatever regret you may politely profess, for which I am obliged to you on behalf of Mrs. Dombey, and you will have the goodness, I am persuaded, to discharge it exactly as any other commission." "You know," said Mr. Carker, "that you have only to command me." "I know," said Mr. Dombey, with a majestic indication of assent, "that I have only to command you. It is necessary that I should proceed in this. Mrs. Dombey is a lady undoubtedly highly qualified in many respects to—" "To do credit even to your choice," suggested Carker, with a fawning show of teeth. "Yes, if you please to adopt that form of words," said Mr. Dombey, in his tone of state. "And at present I do not conceive that Mrs. Dombey does that credit to it, to which it is entitled. There is a principle of opposition in Mrs. Dombey that must be eradicated, that must be overcome. Mrs. Dombey does not appear to understand," said Mr. Dombey forcibly, "that the idea of opposition to me is monstrous and absurd." "We in the city know you better," replied Carker, with a smile from ear to ear. "You know me better," said Mr. Dombey. "I hope so. Though, indeed, I am bound to do Mrs. Dombey the justice of saying, however inconsistent it may seem with her subsequent conduct, which remains unchanged, that on my expressing my disapprobation and determination to her, with some severity, on the occasion to which I have referred, My admonition appeared to produce a very powerful effect. Mr. Dombey delivered himself of those words with most portentous stateliness. "I wish you to have the goodness, then, to inform Mrs. Dombey, Carker, from me, that I must recall our former conversation to her remembrance, in some surprise that it had not yet had its effect; that I must insist upon her regulating her conduct by the injunctions laid upon her in that conversation; that I am not satisfied with her conduct; that I am greatly dissatisfied with it; and that I shall be under the very disagreeable necessity of making you the bearer of yet more unwelcome and explicit communications, if she has not the good sense and the proper feeling to adapt herself to my wishes, as the first Mrs. Dombey did, and I believe I may add, as any other lady in her place would." "The first Mrs. Dombey lived very happily," said Carker. "The first Mrs. Dombey had great good sense," said Mr. Dombey, in a gentlemanly toleration of the dead, "and very correct feeling." "Is Miss Dombey like her mother, do you think?" said Carker. Swiftly and darkly Mr. Dombey's face changed. His confidential agent eyed it keenly. "I have approached a painful subject," he said, in a soft, regretful tone of voice, irreconcilable with his eager eye. "Pray forgive me. I forget these chains of association in the interest I have. Pray forgive me." But, for all he said, his eager eye scanned Mr. Dombey's downcast face none the less closely, and then it shot a strange triumphant look at the picture, and appealing to it to bear witness how he led him on again, and what was coming. "Carker," said Mr. Dombey, looking here and there upon the table, and speaking in a somewhat altered and more hurried voice, and with a paler lip, "there is no occasion for apology. You mistake. The association is with the matter in hand, and not with any recollection, as you suppose. I do not approve of Mrs. Dombey's behaviour towards my daughter." "Pardon me," said Mr. Carker, "I don't quite understand." "Understand, then," returned Mr. Dombey, "that you will make that, if you please, matter of direct objection from me to Mrs. Dombey. You will please to tell her that her show of devotion for my daughter is disagreeable to me. It is likely to be noticed. It is likely to induce people to contrast Mrs. Dombey in her relation towards my daughter with Mrs. Dombey in her relation towards myself. You will have the goodness to let Mrs. Dombey know plainly that I object to it, and that I expect her to defer immediately to my objection. Mrs. Dombey may be in earnest, or she may be pursuing a whim, or she may be opposing me, but I object to it in any case and in every case. If Mrs. Dombey is in earnest, so much the less reluctant should she be to desist, for she will not serve my daughter by any such display. If my wife has any superfluous gentleness and duty over and above her proper submission to me, she may bestow them where she pleases, perhaps, but I will have submission first, Carker," said Mr. Dombey, checking the unusual emotion with which he had spoken, and falling into a tone more like that in which he was accustomed to assert his greatness. "You will have the goodness not to omit or to slur this point, but to consider it a very important part of your instructions." Mr. Carker bowed his head, and rising from the table and standing thoughtfully before the fire with his hand to his smooth chin, looked down at Mr. Dombey with the evil slyness of some monkish carving, half human and half brute, or like a leering face on an old waterspout. Mr. Dombey, recovering his composure by degrees, or cooling his emotion in his sense of having taken a high position, sat gradually stiffening again, and looking at the parrot as she swung to and fro in her great wedding ring. "I beg your pardon," said Carker, after a silence, suddenly resuming his chair and drawing it opposite to Mr. Dombey's. "But let me understand. Mrs. Dombey is aware of the probability of your making me the organ of your displeasure?" "Yes," replied Mr. Dombey, "I have said so." "Yes," rejoined Carker, quickly. "But why?" "Why?" Mr. Dombey repeated, not without hesitation. "Because I told her." "Ay," replied Carker, "but why did you tell her? You see," he continued with a smile, and softly laying his velvet hand, as a cat might have laid its sheathed claws, on Mr. Dombey's arm, "if I perfectly understand what is in your mind, I am so much more likely to be useful, and to have the happiness of being effectually employed." "I think I do understand. I have not the honour of Mrs. Dombey's good opinion. In my position, I have no reason to expect it, but I take the fact to be that I have not got it." "Possibly not," said Mr. Dombey. "Consequently," pursued Carker, "your making these communications to Mrs. Dombey through me is sure to be particularly unpalatable to that lady." "It appears to me," said Mr. Dombey, with haughty reserve, and yet with some embarrassment, "that Mrs. Dombey's views upon the subject form no part of it as it presents itself to you and me, Carker, but it may be so." "And, pardon me, do I misconceive you," said Carker, "when I think you descry in this a likely means of humbling Mrs. Dombey's pride? I use the word as expressive of a quality which, kept within due bounds, adorns and graces a lady so distinguished for her beauty and accomplishments, and not to say of punishing her, but of reducing her to the submission you so naturally and justly require." "I am not accustomed, Carker, as you know," said Mr. Dombey, "to give such close reasons for any course of conduct I think proper to adopt, but I will gainsay nothing of this. If you have any objection to found upon it, that is indeed another thing, and the mere statement that you have one will be sufficient. But I have not supposed, I confess, that any confidence I could entrust to you would be likely to degrade you." "Oh, I degraded!" exclaimed Carker, "in your service, or to place you," pursued Mr. Dombey, "in a false position?" "I in a false position!" exclaimed Carker. "I shall be proud, delighted, to execute your trust. I could have wished, I own, to have given the lady at whose feet I would lay my humble duty and devotion for is she not your wife? No new cause of dislike. But a wish from you is, of course, paramount to every other consideration on earth. Besides, when Mrs. Dombey is converted from these little errors of judgment, incidental, I would presume to say, to the novelty of her situation, I shall hope that she will perceive in the slight part I take only a grain, my removed and different sphere gives room for little more, of the respect for you, and sacrifice of all considerations to you, of which it will be her pleasure and privilege to garner up a great store every day." Mr. Dombey seemed at the moment again to see her with her hand stretched out towards the door, and again to hear through the mild speech of his confidential agent an echo of the words, "Nothing can make us stranger to each other than we are henceforth." But he shook off the fancy, and did not shake in his resolution, and said, "Certainly, no doubt." "There is nothing more," quoth Carker, drawing his chair back to its old place, for they had taken little breakfasts as yet, and pausing for an answer before he sat down. "Nothing," said Mr. Dombey, "but this. You will be good enough to observe, Carker, that no message to Mrs. Dombey with which you are or may be charged admits of reply. You will be good enough to bring me no reply. Mrs. Dombey is informed that it does not become me to temporize or treat upon any matter that is at issue between us, and that what I say is final." Mr. Carker signified his understanding of these credentials, and they fell to breakfast with what appetite they might. The grinder also in due time reappeared, keeping his eyes upon his master without a moment's respite, and passing the time in a reverie of worshipful terror. Breakfast concluded, Mr. Dombey's horse was ordered out again, and Mr. Carker mounting his own, they rode off for the city together. Mr. Carker was in capital spirits, and talked much. Mr. Dombey received his conversation with the sovereign air of a man who had a right to be talked to, and occasionally condescended to throw in a few words to carry on the conversation. So they rode on characteristically enough. But Mr. Dombey, in his dignity, rode with very long stirrups, and a very loose rein, and very rarely deigned to look down to see where his horse went. In consequence of which it happened that Mr. Dombey's horse, while going at a round trot, stumbled on some loose stones, threw him, rolled over him, and lashing out with his iron-shod feet in his struggles to get up, kicked him. Mr. Carker, quick of eye, steady of hand, and a good horseman, was afoot, and had the struggling animal upon his legs and by the bridle in a moment. Otherwise that morning's confidence would have been Mr. Dombey's last. Yet, even with the flush and hurry of this action red upon him, he bent over his prostrate chief with every tooth disclosed, and muttered as he stooped down, "I have given good cause of offence to Mrs. Dombey now, if she knew it." Mr. Dombey, being insensible and bleeding from the head and face, was carried by certain menders of the road, under Carker's direction, to the nearest public house, which was not far off, and where he was soon attended by divers surgeons, who arrived in quick succession from all parts, and who seemed to come by some mysterious instinct, as vultures are said to gather about a camel who dies in the desert. After being at some pains to restore him to consciousness, these gentlemen examined him into the nature of his injuries. One surgeon, who lived hard by, was strong for a compound fracture of the leg, which was the landlord's opinion also, but two surgeons, who lived at a distance, and were only in that neighbourhood by accident, combated this opinion so disinterestedly that it was decided at last that the patient, though severely cut and bruised, had broken no bones, but a lesser rib or so, and might be carefully taken home before night. His injuries being dressed and bandaged, which was a long operation, and he at length left to repose, Mr. Carker mounted his horse again, and rode away to carry the intelligence home. Crafty and cruel as his face was at the best of times, though it was a sufficiently fair face as to form and regularity of feature, it was at its worst when he set forth on this errand, animated by the craft and cruelty of thoughts within him, suggestions of remote possibility rather than of design or plot, that made him ride as if he hunted men and women. Drawing rein at length, and slackening in his speed as he came into the more public roads, he checked his white-legged horse into picking his way along as usual, and hid himself beneath his sleek, hushed, crouched manner, and his ivory smile, as best he could. He rode direct to Mr. Dombey's house, alighted at the door, and begged to see Mrs. Dombey on an affair of importance. The servant showed him to Mr. Dombey's own room, soon returned to say that it was not Mrs. Dombey's hour for receiving visitors, and that he begged pardon for not having mentioned it before. Mr. Carker, who was quite prepared for a cold reception, wrote upon a card that he must take the liberty of pressing for an interview, and that he would not be so bold as to do so for the second time. This he underlined, if he were not equally sure of the occasion being sufficient for his justification. After a trifling delay, Mrs. Dombey's maid appeared, and conducted him to a morning room upstairs, where Edith and Florence were together. He had never thought Edith half so beautiful before. Much as he admired the graces of her face and form, and freshly as they dwelt within his sensual remembrance, he had never thought her half so beautiful. Her glance fell haughtily upon him in the doorway, but he looked at Florence, though only in the act of bending his head as he came in, with some irrepressible expression of the new power he held, and it was his triumph to see the glance droop and falter, and to see that Edith half rose up to receive him. He was very sorry. He was deeply grieved. He couldn't say with what unwillingness he came to prepare her for the intelligence of a very slight accident. He entreated Mrs. Dombey to compose herself. Upon his sacred word of honour, there was no cause of alarm. But Mr. Dombey... Florence uttered a sudden cry. He did not look at her, but at Edith. Edith composed and reassured her. She uttered no cry of distress. No, no. Florence widely exclaimed that he was badly hurt, that he was killed. No, upon his honour, Mr. Dombey, though stunned at first, was soon recovered, and though certainly hurt, was in no kind of danger. If this were not the truth, he, the distressed intruder, never could have had the courage to present himself before Mrs. Dombey. It was the truth indeed, he solemnly assured her. All this he said as if he were answering Edith, and not Florence, and with his eyes and smile fastened on Edith. He then went on to tell her where Mr. Dombey was lying, and to request that a carriage might be placed at his disposal to bring him home. "Mamma," faltered Florence in tears, "if I might venture to go." Mr. Carker, having his eyes on Edith when he heard these words, gave her a secret look and slightly shook his head. He saw how she battled with herself before she answered him with her handsome eyes, but he wrested the answer from her. He showed her that he would have it, or that he would speak and cut Florence to the heart, and she gave it to him. As he had looked at the picture in the morning, so he looked at her afterwards, when she turned her eyes away. "I am directed to request," he said, "that the new housekeeper, Mrs. Pipchin, I think is the name." Nothing escaped him. He saw in an instant that she was another slight of Mr. Dombey's on his wife. "May be informed that Mr. Dombey wishes to have his bed prepared in his own apartments downstairs, as he prefers those rooms to any other. I shall return to Mr. Dombey almost immediately. That every possible attention has been paid to his comfort, and that he is the object of every possible solicitude, I need not assure you, madam. Let me say again, there is no cause for the least alarm. Even you may be quite at ease, believe me." He bowed himself out with his extremest show of deference and conciliation, and having returned to Mr. Dombey's room, and there arranged for a carriage being sent after him to the city, mounted his horse again, and rode slowly thither. He was very thoughtful as he went along, and very thoughtful there, and very thoughtful in the carriage on his way back to the place where Mr. Dombey had been left. It was only when sitting by that gentleman's couch that he was quite himself again, and conscious of his teeth. About the time of twilight, Mr. Dombey, grievously afflicted with aches and pains, was helped into his carriage, and propped with cloaks and pillows on one side of it, while his confidential agent bore him company upon the other. As he was not to be shaken, they moved at little more than a foot pace, and hence it was quite dark when he was brought home. Mrs. Pipchin, bitter and grim, and not oblivious of the Peruvian mines, as the establishment in general had good reason to know, received him at the door, and freshened the domestics with several little sprinklings of wordy vinegar, while they assisted in conveying him to his room. Mr. Carker remained in attendance until he was safe in bed, and then, as he declined to receive any female visitor but the excellent ogress who presided over his household, waited on Mrs. Dombey once more, with his report on her lord's condition. He found Edith alone with Florence, and he again addressed the whole of his soothing speech to Edith, as if she were a prey to the liveliest and most affectionate anxieties. So earnest he was in his respectful sympathy that on taking leave, he ventured, with one more glance towards Florence at the moment, to take her hand, and bending over it, to touch it with his lips. Edith did not withdraw the hand, nor did she strike his fair face with it, despite the flush upon her cheek, the bright light in her eyes, and the dilation of her whole form. But when she was alone in her own room, she struck it on the marble chimney shelf, so that, at one blow, it was bruised and bled, and held it from her, near the shining fire, as if she could have thrust it in and burned it. Far into the night she sat alone by the sinking blaze, in dark and threatening beauty, watching the murky shadows looming on the wall, as if her thoughts were tangible, and cast them there. Whatever shapes of outrage and affront, and black foreshadowings of things that might happen, flickered, indistinct and giant-like, before her, one resented figure marshalled them against her. And that figure was her husband. End of chapter 42. Of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Chapter 43. The Watches of the Night. Florence, long since awakened from her dream, mournfully observed the estrangement between her father and Edith, and saw it widen more and more, and knew that there was greater bitterness between them every day. Each day's added knowledge deepened the shade upon her love and hope, roused up the old sorrow that had slumbered for a little time, and made it even heavier to bear than it had been before. It had been hard, how hard may none but Florence ever know, to have the natural affection of a true and earnest nature turned to agony, and slight or stern repulse substituted for the tenderest protection and the dearest care. It had been hard to feel in her deep heart what she had felt, and never know the happiness of one touch of response. But it was much more hard to be compelled to doubt either her father or Edith, so affectionate and dear to her, and to think of her love for each of them by turns with fear, distrust, and wonder. Yet Florence now began to do so, and the doing of it was a task imposed upon her by the very purity of her soul, as one she could not fly from. She saw her father cold and obdurate to Edith, as to her hard, inflexible, unyielding. Could it be, she asked herself with starting tears, that her own dear mother had been made unhappy by such treatment, and had pined away and died? Then she would think how proud and stately Edith was to everyone but her, with what disdain she treated him, how distantly she kept apart from him, and what she had said on the night when she came home. And quickly it would come on Florence, almost as a crime, that she loved one who was set in opposition to her father, and that her father, knowing of it, must think of her in his solitary room as the unnatural child who added this wrong to the old fault, so much wept for, of never having won his fatherly affection from her birth. The next kind word from Edith, the next kind glance, would shake these thoughts again, and make them seem like black ingratitude, for who but she had cheered the drooping heart of Florence, so lonely and so hurt, and had been its best of comforters. Thus, with her gentle nature yearning to them both, feeling the misery of both, and whispering doubts of her own duty to both, Florence, in her wider and expanded love, and by the side of Edith, endured more than when she had hoarded up her undivided secret in the mournful house, and her beautiful mamma had never dawned upon it. One exquisite unhappiness that would have far outweighed this, Florence was spared. She never had the least suspicion that Edith, by her tenderness for her, widened the separation from her father, or gave him new cause of dislike. If Florence had conceived the possibility of such an effect being wrought by such a cause, what grief she would have felt, what sacrifice she would have tried to make, poor loving girl! How fast and sure her quiet passage might have been beneath it to the presence of that higher Father who does not reject his children's love, or spurn their tried and broken hearts, heaven knows. But it was otherwise, and that was well. No word was ever spoken between Florence and Edith now on these subjects. Edith had said there ought to be between them in that wise a division and a silence like the grave itself, and Florence felt that she was right. In this state of affairs her father was brought home suffering and disabled, and gloomily retired to his own rooms, where he was tended by servants, not approached by Edith, and had no friend or companion but Mr. Carker, who withdrew near midnight. "And nice company he is, Miss Floy," said Susan Nipper. "Oh, he's a precious piece of goods. If ever he wants a character, don't let him come to me, whatever he does. That's all I tell him." "Dear Susan," urged Florence, "don't." "Oh, it's very well to say don't, Miss Floy," returned the Nipper, much exasperated. "But rally, begging your pardon, we're coming to such passes that it turns all the blood in a person's body into pins and needles with their pints always. Don't mistake me, Miss Floy. I don't mean nothing against your ma-in-law, who is always treating me as a lady should, though she is rather high, I must say. Not that I have any right to object to that particular. But when we come to Mrs. Pippinches, and having them put over us, and keeping guard at your pa's door like crocodiles, only make us thankful that they lay no eggs. We are a growing too outrageous." "Papa thinks well of Mrs. Pipchin, Susan," returned Florence, "and has a right to choose his housekeeper, you know. Pray don't." "Well, Miss Floy," returned the Nipper, "when you say don't, I never do, I hope. But Mrs. Pipchin acts like early gooseberries upon me, miss, and nothing less." Susan was unusually emphatic and destitute of punctuation in her discourse on this night, which was the night of Mr. Dombey's being brought home, because, having been sent downstairs by Florence to inquire after him, she had been obliged to deliver her message to her mortal enemy, Mrs. Pipchin, who, without carrying it in to Mr. Dombey, had taken upon herself to return what Miss Nipper called a huffish answer on her own responsibility. This Susan Nipper construed into presumption on the part of that exemplary sufferer by the Peruvian mines, and a deed of disparagement upon her young lady that was not to be forgiven, and so far her emphatic state was special. But she had been in a condition of greatly increased suspicion and distrust ever since the marriage, for, like most persons of her quality of mind, who form a strong and sincere attachment to one in the different station which Florence occupied, Susan was very jealous, and her jealousy naturally attached to Edith, who divided her old empire and came between them. Proud and glad as Susan Nipper truly was that her young mistress should be advanced toward her proper place in the scene of her own neglect, and that she should have her father's handsome wife for her companion and protectress, she could not relinquish any part of her own dominion to the handsome wife, without a grudge and a vague feeling of ill will, for which she did not fail to find a disinterested justification in her sharp perception of the pride and passion of the lady's character. From the background to which she had necessarily retired somewhat since the marriage, Miss Nipper looked on, therefore, at domestic affairs in general, with a resolute conviction that no good would come of Mrs. Dombey, always being very careful to publish on all possible occasions that she had nothing to say against her. "Susan," said Florence, who was sitting thoughtfully at her table, "it is very late. I shall want nothing more to-night." "Ah, Miss Floy," returned the Nipper, "I'm sure I often wish for them old times when I sat up with you hours later than this and fell asleep through being tired out, when you was as broad awake as spectacles. But you've ma-in-law to come and sit with you now, Miss Floy, and I'm thankful for it, I'm sure. I've not a word to say against 'em." "I shall not forget who was my old companion when I had none, Susan," returned Florence, gently. "Never." And looking up, she put her arm round the neck of her humble friend, drew her face down to hers, and bidding her good night, kissed it, which so mollified Miss Nipper that she fell a-sobbing. "Now, my dear Miss Floy," said Susan, "let me go downstairs again, and see how your pa is. I know you're wretched about him. Do let me go downstairs again, and knock at his door my own self." "No," said Florence, "go to bed. We shall hear more in the morning. I will inquire myself in the morning. Mamma has been down, I dare say." Florence blushed, for she had no such hope, or is there now, perhaps. "Good night." Susan was too much softened to express her private opinion on the probability of Mrs. Dombey's being in attendance on her husband, and silently withdrew. Florence, left alone, soon hid her head upon her hands, as she had often done in other days, and did not restrain the tears from coursing down her face. The misery of this domestic discord and unhappiness, the withered hope she cherished now, if hope it could be called, of ever being taken to her father's heart, her doubts and fears between the two, the yearning of her innocent breast to both, the heavy disappointment and regret of such an end as this to what had been a vision of bright hope and promise to her, all crowded on her mind and made her tears flow fast. Her mother and her brother dead, her father unmoved towards her, Edith opposed to him and casting him away, but loving her, and loved by her. It seemed as if her affection could never prosper, rest where it would. That weak thought was soon hushed, but the thoughts in which it had arisen were too true and strong to be dismissed with it, and they made the night desolate. Among such reflection there rose up, as there had risen up all day, the image of her father, wounded and in pain, alone in his own room, untended by those who should be nearest to him, and passing the tardy hours in lonely suffering. A frightened thought which made her start and clasp her hands, though it was not a new one in her mind, that he might die, and never see her or pronounce her name, thrilled her whole frame. In her agitation she thought, and trembled while she thought, of once more stealing downstairs and venturing to his door. She listened at her own. The house was quiet, and all the lights were out. It was a long, long time, she thought, since she used to make her nightly pilgrimage to his door. It was a long, long time she tried to think since she had entered his room at midnight, and he had led her back to the stair-foot. With the same child's heart within her, as of old, even with the child's sweet timid eyes and clustering hair, Florence, as strange to her father in her early maiden bloom as in her nursery time, crept down the staircase, listening as she went, and drew near to his room. No one was stirring in the house. The door was partly open to admit air, and all was so still within that she could hear the burning of the fire and count the ticking of the clock that stood upon the chimney-piece. She looked in. In that room the housekeeper, wrapped in a blanket, was fast asleep in an easy-chair before the fire. The doors between it and the next were partly closed, and a screen was drawn before them, but there was a light there, and it shone upon the cornice of his bed. All was so very still that she could hear from his breathing that he was asleep. This gave her courage to pass round the screen and look into his chamber. It was as great a start to come upon his sleeping face as if she had not expected to see it. Florence stood arrested on the spot, and if he had awakened then, must have remained there. There was a cut upon his forehead, and they had been wetting his hair, which lay bedabbed and entangled on the pillow. One of his arms, resting outside the bed, was bandaged up, and he was very white. But it was not this, that after the first quick glance and first assurance of his sleeping quietly held Florence rooted to the ground. It was something very different from this, and more than this, that made him look so solemn in her eyes. She had never seen his face in all her life, but there had been upon it, or she fancied so, some disturbing consciousness of her. She had never seen his face in all her life, but hope had sunk within her, and her timid glance had drooped before its stern, unloving, and repelling harshness. As she looked upon it now, she saw it, for the first time, free from the cloud that had darkened her childhood. Calm, tranquil night was reigning in its stead. He might have gone to sleep, for anything she saw there, blessing her. Awake, unkind father, awake now, sullen man. The time is flitting by, the hour is coming with an angry tread. Awake! There was no change upon his face, and as she watched it awfully, its motionless repose recalled the faces that were gone. So they looked, so would he, so she, his weeping child. Who should say when? So all the world of love and hatred and indifference around them. When that time should come, it would not be the heavier to him for this that she was going to do, and it might fall something lighter upon her. She stole close to the bed, and drawing in her breath, bent down and softly kissed him on the face, and laid her own for one brief moment by its side, and put the arm, with which she dared not touch him, round about him on the pillow. Awake, doomed man, while she is near. The time is flitting by. The hour is coming with an angry tread. Its foot is in the house. Awake! In her mind she prayed to God to bless her father, and to soften him towards her, if it might be so, and if not, to forgive him if he was wrong, and pardon her the prayer which almost seemed impiety. And doing so, and looking back at him with blinded eyes, and stealing timidly away, passed out of his room and crossed the other, and was gone. He may sleep on now. He may sleep on while he may, but let him look for that slight figure when he wakes, and find it near him when the hour is come. Sad and grieving was the heart of Florence as she crept upstairs. The quiet house had grown more dismal since she came down. The sleep she had been looking on in the dead of night had the solemnity to her of death and life in one. The secrecy and silence of her own proceeding made the night secret, silent, and oppressive. She felt unwilling, almost unable, to go on to her own chamber, and turning into the drawing rooms, where the clouded moon was shining through the blinds, looked out into the empty streets. The wind was blowing drearily. The lamps looked pale and shook as if they were cold. There was a distant glimmer of something that was not quite darkness, rather than of light, in the sky, and foreboding night was shivering and restless, as the dying are who make a troubled end. Florence remembered how, as a watcher by a sick bed, she had noted this bleak time, and felt its influence, as if in some hidden natural antipathy to it. And now it was very, very gloomy. Her mamma had not come to her room that night, which was one cause of her having sat late out of her bed. In her general uneasiness, no less than in her ardent longing to have somebody to speak to and to break the spell of gloom and silence, Florence directed her steps towards the chamber where she slept. The door was not fastened within, and yielded smoothly to her hesitating hand. She was surprised to find a bright light burning, still more surprised, on looking in, to see that her mamma, but partially undressed, was sitting near the ashes of the fire, which had crumbled and dropped away. Her eyes were intently bent upon the air, and in their light, and in her face, and in her form, and in the grasp with which she held the elbows of her chair as if about to start up, Florence saw such fierce emotion that it terrified her. "Mamma," she cried, "what is the matter?" Edith started, looking at her with such a strange dread in her face that Florence was more frightened than before. "Mamma," said Florence, hurriedly advancing, "dear mamma, what is the matter?" "I have not been well," said Edith, shaking, and still looking at her in the same strange way. "I have had bad dreams, my love." "And yet not been to bed, mamma?" "No," she returned, "half-waking dreams." Her features gradually softened, and suffering Florence to come close to her within her embrace, she said in a tender manner, "But what does my bird do here? What does my bird do here?" "I have been uneasy, mamma, in not seeing you to-night, and in not knowing how papa was, and I." Florence stopped there, and said no more. "Is it late?" asked Edith, fondly putting back the curls that mingled with her own dark hair and strayed upon her face. "Very late. Near day." "Near day!" she repeated in surprise. "Dear mamma, what have you done to your hand?" said Florence. Edith drew it suddenly away, and for a moment looked at her with the same strange dread. There was a sort of wild avoidance in it, as before, but she presently said, "Nothing, nothing, a blow." And then she said, "My Florence!" And then her bosom heaved, and she was weeping passionately. "Mamma," said Florence, "oh, mamma, what can I do? What should I do to make us happier? Is there anything?" "Nothing," she replied. "Are you sure of that? Can it never be? If I speak now of what is in my thoughts, in spite of what we have agreed," said Florence, "you will not blame me, will you?" "It is useless," she replied, "useless. I have told you, dear, that I have had bad dreams. Nothing can change them, or prevent their coming back." "I do not understand," said Florence, gazing on her agitated face, which seemed to darken as she looked. "I have dreamed," said Edith in a low voice, "of a pride that is all powerless for good, all powerful for evil, of a pride that has been galled and goaded through many shameful years, and has never recoiled except upon itself, a pride that has debased its owner with the consciousness of deep humiliation, and never helped its owner boldly to resent it or avoid it, or to say, "This shall not be," a pride that, rightly guided, might have led perhaps to better things, but which, misdirected and perverted, like all else belonging to the same possessor, has been self-contempt, mere hardihood, and ruin. She neither looked nor spoke to Florence now, but went on as if she were alone. "I have dreamed," she said, "of such indifference and callousness arising from this self-contempt, this wretched, inefficient, miserable pride, that it has gone on with listless steps even to the altar, yielding to the old familiar beckoning finger, 'O mother, O mother,' while it spurned it, and willing to be hateful to itself for once and for all, rather than to be stung daily in some new form. Mean, poor thing!" And now, with gathering and darkening emotion, she looked as she had looked when Florence entered. "And I have dreamed," she said, "that in a first late effort to achieve a purpose, it has been trodden on and trodden down by a base foot, but turns and looks upon him. I have dreamed that it is wounded, hunted, set upon by dogs, but that it stands at bay and will not yield. No, that it cannot if it would, but that it is urged on to hate him, rise against him, and defy him." Her clenched hand tightened on the trembling arm she had in hers, and as she looked down on the alarmed and wondering face, her own subsided. "Oh, Florence," she said, "I think I have been nearly mad to-night," and humbled her proud head upon her neck and wept again. "Don't leave me. Be near me. I have no hope but in you." These words she said a score of times. Soon she grew calmer, and was full of pity for the tears of Florence, and for her waking at such untimely hours. And the day now dawning, Edith folded her in her arms and laid her down upon her bed, and, not lying down herself, sat by her and bade her try to sleep. "For you are weary, dearest, and unhappy, and should rest." "I am indeed unhappy, dear mamma, to-night," said Florence. "But you are weary and unhappy too." "Not when you lie asleep so near me, sweet." They kissed each other, and Florence, worn out, gradually fell into a gentle slumber, but as her eyes closed on the face beside her, it was so sad to think upon the face downstairs, that her hand drew closer to Edith for some comfort. Yet, even in the act, it faltered, lest it should be deserting him. So, in her sleep, she tried to reconcile the two together, and to show them that she loved them both, but could not do it, and her waking grief was part of her dreams. Edith, sitting by, looked down at the dark eyelashes lying wet on the flushed cheeks, and looked with gentleness and pity, for she knew the truth. But no sleep hung upon her own eyes. As the day came on, she still sat watching and waking, with the placid hand in hers, and sometimes whispered, as she looked at the hushed face, "Be near me, Florence. I have no hope but in you." End of chapter 43. 44 of Dombey and Son. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Cynthia Lyons. Dombey and Son by Charles Dickens. Chapter 44. A Separation. With the day, though not so early as the sun, uprose Miss Susan Nipper. There was a heaviness in this young maiden's exceedingly sharp black eyes that abated somewhat of their sparkling, and suggested, which was not their usual character, the possibility of their being sometimes shut. There was likewise a swollen look about them, as if they had been crying overnight. But the nipper, so far from being cast down, was singularly brisk and bold, and all her energies appeared to be braced up for some great feat. This was noticeable even in her dress, which was much more tight and trim than usual, and in occasional twitches of her head as she went about the house, which were mightily expressive of determination. In a word, she had formed a determination, and an aspiring one, it being nothing less than this, to penetrate to Mr. Dombey's presence, and have speech of that gentleman alone. "I have often said I would," she remarked in a threatening manner to herself that morning, with many twitches of her head, "and now I will." Spurring herself on to the accomplishment of this desperate design, with a sharpness that was peculiar to herself, Susan Nipper haunted the hall and staircase during the whole forenoon, without finding a favourable opportunity for the assault, not at all baffled by this discomfiture, which indeed had a stimulating effect, and put her on her mettle. She diminished nothing of her vigilance, and at last discovered toward evening that her sworn foe, Mrs. Pipchin, under pretence of having sat up all night, was dozing in her own room, and that Mr. Dombey was lying on his sofa, unattended. With a twitch, not of her head merely this time, but of her whole self, the nipper went on tiptoe to Mr. Dombey's door and knocked. "Come in," said Mr. Dombey. Susan encouraged herself with a final twitch, and went in. Mr. Dombey, who was eyeing the fire, gave an amazed look at his visitor, and raised himself a little on his arm. The nipper dropped a curtsy. "What do you want?" said Mr. Dombey. "If you please, sir, I wish to speak to you," said Susan. Mr. Dombey moved his lips as if he were repeating the words, but he seemed so lost in astonishment at the presumption of the young woman as to be incapable of giving them utterance. "I have been in your service, sir," said Susan Nipper, with her usual rapidity, "now 12 year a-waiting on Miss Floy, my own young lady, who couldn't speak plain when I first come here, and I was old in this house when Mrs. Richards was new. I may not be Methusalem, but I am not a child in arms." Mr. Dombey raised upon his arm, and looking at her, offered no comment on this preparatory statement of facts. "There never was a dearer or blesseder young lady than is my young lady, sir," said Susan, "and I ought to know a great deal better than some, for I have seen her in her grief, and I have seen her in her joy. There's not been much of it. And I have seen her with her brother, and I have seen her in her loneliness, and some have never seen her, and I say to some and all I do." And here the black-eyed shook her head and slightly stamped her foot. "That she's the blessedest and dearest angel is Miss Floy, that ever drew the breath of life. The more that I was torn to pieces, sir, the more I'd say it, though I may not be a fox's martyr." Mr. Dombey turned yet paler than his fall had made him, with indignation and astonishment, and kept his eyes upon the speaker as if he accused them, and his ears too, of playing him false. "No one could be anything but true and faithful to Miss Floy, sir," pursued Susan, "and I take no merit for my service of 12 year, for I love her. Yes, I say, to some and all I do." And here the black-eyed shook her head again, and slightly stamped her foot again, and checked a sob. "But true and faithful service gives me right to speak, I hope, and speak I must, and will now, right or wrong." "What do you mean, woman?" said Mr. Dombey, glaring at her. "How do you dare?" "What I mean, sir, is to speak respectful and without offence, but out, and how I dare I know not, but I do," said Susan. "Oh, you don't know my young lady, sir, you don't indeed. You'd never know so little of her if you did." Mr. Dombey, in a fury, put his hand out for the bell-rope, but there was no bell-rope on that side of the fire, and he could not rise and cross to the other without assistance. The quick eye of the nipper detected his helplessness immediately, and now, as she afterwards observed, she felt that she had got him. "Miss Floy," said Susan Nipper, "is the most devoted and the most patient and most dutiful and beautiful of daughters. There ain't no gentleman, sir, though as great and rich as all the greatest and richest of England put together, but might be proud of her, and would and ought. If he knew her value right, he'd rather lose his greatness and his fortune piece by piece, and beg his way in rags from door to door. I say to some and all he would," cried Susan Nipper, bursting into tears, "than bring the sorrow on her tender heart that I have seen it suffer in this house." "Woman," cried Mr. Dombey, "leave the room." "Begging your pardon, not even if I am to leave the situation, sir," replied the steadfast Nipper, "in which I have been so many years and seen so much, although I hope you'd never have the heart to send me from Miss Floy for such a cause. Will I go now till I have said the rest? I may not be an Indian widow, sir, and I am not, and I would not so become, but if I once made up my mind to burn myself alive, I'd do it, and I've made my mind up to go on." Which was rendered no less clear by the expression of Susan Nipper's countenance than by her words. "There ain't a person in your service, sir," pursued the black-eyed, "that has always stood more in awe of you than me, and you may think how true it is when I make so bold as say that I have hundreds and hundreds of times thought of speaking to you, and never been able to make my mind up to it till last night, but last night decided of me." Mr. Dombey, in a paroxysm of rage, made another grasp at the bell-rope that was not there, and in its absence pulled his hair rather than nothing. "I have seen," said Susan Nipper, "Miss Floy strive and strive when nothing but a child so sweet and patient that the best of women might have copied from her. I've seen her sitting nights together, half the night through, to help her delicate brother with his learning. I've seen her helping him and watching him at other times. Some well know when. I've seen her, with no encouragement and no help, grow up to be a lady, thank God. That is the grace and pride of every company she goes in, and I've always seen her cruelly neglected, and keenly feeling of it. I say to some and all, I have, and never said one word, but ordering oneself lowly and reverently towards one's betters is not to be a worshipper of graven images, and I will and must speak." "Is there anybody there?" cried Mr. Dombey, calling out. "Where are the men? Where are the women? Is there no one there?" "I left my dear young lady out of bed late last night," said Susan, nothing checked, "and I knew why. For you was ill, sir, and she didn't know how ill, and that was enough to make her wretched, as I saw it did. I may not be a peacock, but I have my eyes, and I sat up a little in my own room, thinking she might be lonesome and might want me, and I saw her steal downstairs and come to this door, as if it was a guilty thing to look at her own pa, and then steal back again, and go into them lonely drawing-rooms, a-crying so that I could hardly bear to hear it. I cannot bear to hear it," said Susan Nipper, wiping her black eyes and fixing them undauntedly on Mr. Dombey's infuriated face. "It's not the first time I have heard it, not by many and many a time. You don't know your own daughter, sir. You don't know what you're doing, sir. I say to some and all," cried Susan Nipper, in a final burst, "that it's a sinful shame." "Why, hoity-toity!" cried the voice of Mrs. Pipchin, as the black bombazine garments of that fair Peruvian miner swept into the room. "What's this indeed?" Susan favoured Mrs. Pipchin with a look she had invented expressly for her when they first became acquainted, and resigned the reply to Mr. Dombey. "What's this?" repeated Mr. Dombey, almost foaming. "What's this, madam? You who are at the head of this household, and bound to keep it in order, have reason to inquire. Do you know this woman?" "I know very little good of her, sir," croaked Mrs. Pipchin. "How dare you come here, you hussy? Go along with you." But the inflexible Nipper, merely honouring Mrs. Pipchin with another look, remained. "Do you call it managing this establishment, madam," said Mr. Dombey, "to leave a person like this at liberty to come and talk to me, a gentleman in his own house, in his own room, assailed with the impertinences of women servants?" "Well, sir," returned Mrs. Pipchin, with vengeance in her hard grey eye, "I exceedingly deplore it. Nothing can be more irregular. Nothing can be more out of all bounds and reason. But I regret to say, sir, that this young woman is quite beyond control. She has been spoiled by Miss Dombey, and is amenable to nobody." "You know you're not," said Mrs. Pipchin sharply, and shaking her head at Susan Nipper. "For shame, you hussy! Go along with you." "If you find people in my service who are not to be controlled, Mrs. Pipchin," said Mr. Dombey, turning back towards the fire, "you know what to do with them, I presume. You know what you are here for. Take her away." "Sir, I know what to do," retorted Mrs. Pipchin, "and of course shall do it. Susan Nipper," snapping her up particularly short, "a month's warning from this hour." "Oh, indeed!" cried Susan loftily. "Yes," returned Mrs. Pipchin, "and don't smile at me, you minx, or I'll know the reason why. Go along with you this minute." "I intend to go this minute, you may rely upon it," said the voluble Nipper. "I have been in this house waiting on my young lady a dozen year, and I won't stop it in 1 hour under notice from a person owning to the name of Pipchin. Trust me, Mrs. P." "A good riddance of bad rubbish," said that wrathful old lady. "Get along with you, or I'll have you carried out." "My comfort is," said Susan, looking back at Mr. Dombey, "that I have told a piece of truth this day, which ought to have been told long before, and can't be told too often or too plain, and that no amount of Pipchinses I hope the number of 'em mayn't be great" here Mrs. Pipchin uttered a very sharp "Go along with you," and Miss Nipper repeated the look, "can unsay what I have said, though they gave a whole year full of warnings, beginning at 10 o'clock in the forenoon, and never leaving off till 12 at night, and died of the exhaustion which would be a jubilee." With these words, Miss Nipper preceded her foe out of the room, and walking upstairs to her own apartments in great state, to the choking exasperation of the ireful Pipchin, sat down among her boxes and began to cry. From this soft mood she was soon aroused, with a very wholesome and refreshing effect, by the voice of Mrs. Pipchin outside the door. "Does that bold-faced slut," said the fell Pipchin, "intend to take her warning, or does she not?" Miss Nipper replied from within that the person described did not inhabit that part of the house, but that her name was Pipchin, and she was to be found in the housekeeper's room. "You saucy baggage!" retorted Mrs. Pipchin, rattling at the handle of the door. "Go along with you this minute. Pack up your things directly. How dare you talk in this way to a gentlewoman who has seen better days?" To which Miss Nipper rejoined from her castle that she pitied the better days that had seen Mrs. Pipchin, and that, for her part, she considered the worst days in the year to be about that lady's mark, except that they were much too good for her. "But you needn't trouble yourself to make a noise at my door," said Susan Nipper, "nor to contaminate the keyhole with your eye. I'm packing up and going. You may take your affidavit." The dowager expressed her lively satisfaction at this intelligence, and with some general opinions upon young hussies as a race, and especially upon their demerits after being spoiled by Miss Dombey, withdrew to prepare the Nippers' wages. Susan then bestirred herself to get her trunks in order, that she might take an immediate and dignified departure, sobbing heartily all the time as she thought of Florence. The object of her regret was not long in coming to her, for the news soon spread over the house that Susan Nipper had had a disturbance with Mrs. Pipchin, and that they had both appealed to Mr. Dombey, and that there had been an unprecedented piece of work in Mr. Dombey's room, and that Susan was going. The latter part of this confused rumour Florence found to be so correct, that Susan had locked the last trunk and was sitting upon it with her bonnet on, when she came into her room. "Susan!" cried Florence. "Going to leave me? You?" "Oh, for goodness gracious sake, Miss Floy," said Susan, sobbing, "don't speak a word to me, or I shall demean myself before them Pipchins, and I wouldn't have them see me cry, Floy, for worlds." "Susan," said Florence, "my dear girl, my old friend, what shall I do without you? Can you bear to go away so?" "No, my darling dear Miss Floy, I can't indeed," sobbed Susan, "but it can't be helped. I've done my duty, miss. I have indeed. It's no fault of mine. I am quite resigned. I couldn't stay my month, or I could never leave you then, my darling, and I must at last, as well as at first. Don't speak to me, Miss Floy, for though I'm pretty firm, I'm not a marble doorpost, my own dear." "What is it? Why is it?" said Florence. "Won't you tell me?" For Susan was shaking her head. No, my darling," returned Susan. "Don't ask me, for I mustn't, and whatever you do, don't put in a word for me to stop, for it couldn't be, and you'd only wrong yourself, and so God bless you, my own precious, and forgive me any harm I have done, or any temper I have showed in all these many years." With which entreaty, very heartily delivered, Susan hugged her mistress in her arms. "My darling, there's a many that may come to serve you, and be glad to serve you, and who'll serve you well and true," said Susan, "but there can't be one who'll serve you so affectionate as me, or love you half as dearly. That's my comfort. Good-bye, sweet Miss Floy." "Where will you go, Susan?" asked her weeping mistress. "I've got a brother down in the country, miss, a farmer in Essex," said the heartbroken Nipper, "that keeps ever so many cows and pigs, and I shall go down there by the coach and stop with him. And don't mind me, for I've got money in the savings bank, my dear, and needn't take another service just yet, which I couldn't do, my heart's own mistress." Susan finished with a burst of sorrow, which was opportunely broken by the voice of Mrs. Pipchin talking downstairs, on hearing which she dried her red and swollen eyes, and made a melancholy feint of calling jauntily to Mr. Towlinson to fetch a cab and carry down her boxes. Florence, pale and hurried and distressed, but withheld from useless interference even here by her dread of causing any new division between her father and his wife, whose stern, indignant face had been a warning to her a few moments since, and by her apprehension of being in some way unconsciously connected already with the dismissal of her own servant and friend, followed, weeping, downstairs to Edith's dressing room, whither Susan betook herself to make her parting curtsy. "Now, Here's the cab, and here's the boxes. Get along with you, do," said Mrs. Pipchin, presenting herself at the same moment. "I beg your pardon, ma'am, but Mr. Dombey's orders are imperative." Edith, sitting under the hands of her maid, she was going out to dinner, preserved her haughty face, and took not the least notice. "There's your money," said Mrs. Pipchin, who, in pursuance of her system, and in recollection of the mines, was accustomed to rout the servants about, as she had routed her young Brighton boarders, to the everlasting acidulation of Master Bitherstone. "And the sooner this house sees your back, the better." Susan had no spirits even for the look that belonged to Mrs. Pipchin by right, so she dropped her curtsy to Mrs. Dombey, who inclined her head without one word, and whose eye avoided everyone but Florence, and gave one last parting hug to her young mistress, and received her parting embrace in return. Poor Susan's face at this crisis, in the intensity of her feelings and the determined suffocation of her sobs, lest one should become audible and be a triumph to Mrs. Pipchin, presented a series of the most extraordinary physiognomical phenomena ever witnessed. "I beg your pardon, miss, I'm sure," said Towlinson, outside the door with the boxes, addressing Florence. "But Mr. Toots is in the drawing-room, and sends his compliments, and begs to know how Diogenes and master is." Quick as thought, Florence glided out and hastened downstairs, where Mr. Toots, in the most splendid vestments, was breathing very hard with doubt and agitation on the subject of her coming. "Oh, how d'ye do, Miss Dombey?" said Mr. Toots. "God bless my soul." This last ejaculation was occasioned by Mr. Toots's deep concern at the distress he saw in Florence's face, which caused him to stop short in a fit of chuckles, and become an image of despair. "Dear Mr. Toots," said Florence, "you are so friendly to me, and so honest, that I am sure I may ask a favour of you." "Miss Dombey," returned Mr. Toots, "if you'll only name one, you'll give me an appetite." To which said Mr. Toots with some sentiment, "I have long been a stranger." "Susan, who is an old friend of mine, the oldest friend I have," said Florence, "is about to leave here suddenly, and quite alone, poor girl. She is going home, a little way into the country. Might I ask you to take care of her until she is in the coach?" "Miss Dombey," returned Mr. Toots, "you really do me an honour and a kindness. This proof of your confidence, after the manner in which I was beast enough to conduct myself at Brighton." "Yes," said Florence hurriedly. "No, don't think of that." "Then would you have the kindness to go, and to be ready to meet her when she comes out? Thank you 1,000 times. You ease my mind so much. She doesn't seem so desolate. You cannot think how grateful I feel to you, or what a good friend I am sure you are." And Florence, in her earnestness, thanked him again and again, and Mr. Toots, in his earnestness, hurried away, but backwards, that he might lose no glimpse of her. Florence had not the courage to go out, and when she saw poor Susan in the hall, with Mrs. Pipchin driving her forth, and Diogenes jumping about her, and terrifying Mrs. Pipchin to the last degree by making snaps at her bombazine skirts, and howling with anguish at the sound of her voice, for the good duenna was the dearest and most cherished aversion of his breast. But she saw Susan shake hands with the servants all round, and turn once to look at her old home, and she saw Diogenes bound out after the cab, and want to follow it, and testify an impossibility of conviction that he had no longer any property in the fare, and the door was shut, and the hurry over, and her tears flowed fast for the loss of an old friend whom no one could replace. No one. No one. Mr. Toots, like the leal and trusty soul he was, stopped the cabriolet in a twinkling and told Susan Nipper of his commission, at which she cried more than before. "Upon my soul and body," said Mr. Toots, taking his seat beside her, "I feel for you. Upon my word and honour, I think you can hardly know your own feelings better than I imagine them. I can conceive nothing more dreadful than to have to leave Miss Dombey." Susan abandoned herself to her grief now, and it really was touching to see her. "I say," said Mr. Toots. "Now don't, at least I mean now do, you know." "Do what, Mr. Toots?" cried Susan. "Why, come home to my place and have some dinner before you start," said Mr. Toots. "My cook's a most respectable woman, one of the most motherly people I ever saw, and she'll be delighted to make you comfortable." Her son, said Mr. Toots, as an additional recommendation, was educated in the Blue Coat School and blown up in a powder mill. Susan accepting this kind offer, Mr. Toots conducted her to his dwelling, where they were received by the matron in question, who fully justified his character of her, and by the chicken, who at first supposed, on seeing a lady in the vehicle, that Mr. Dombey had been doubled up agreeably to his old recommendation, and Miss Dombey abducted. This gentleman awakened in Miss Nipper some considerable astonishment, for, having been defeated by the Larky boy, his visage was in a state of such great dilapidation as to be hardly presentable in society with comfort to the beholders. The chicken himself attributed this punishment to his having had the misfortune to get into Chancery early in the proceedings, when he was severely fibbed by the Larky one, and heavily grassed. But it appeared from the published records of that great contest that the Larky boy had had it all his own way from the beginning, and that the chicken had been tapped and bunged, and had received pepper, and had been made groggy, and had come up piping, and had endured a complication of similar strange inconveniences, until he had been gone into and finished. After a good repast and much hospitality, Susan set out for the coach office in another cabriolet, with Mr. Toots inside as before, and the chicken on the box, who, whatever distinction he conferred on the little party by the moral weight and heroism of his character, was scarcely ornamental to it, physically speaking, on account of his plasters, which were numerous. But the chicken had registered a vow in secret that he would never leave Mr. Toots, who was secretly pining to get rid of him, for any less consideration than the goodwill and fixtures of a public house, and being ambitious to go into that line and drink himself to death as soon as possible, he felt it his cue to make his company unacceptable. The night coach by which Susan was to go was on the point of departure. Mr. Toots, having put her inside, lingered by the window irresolutely until the driver was about to mount, when, standing on the step and putting in a face that by the light of the lamp was anxious and confused, he said abruptly, "I say, Susan, Miss Dombey, you know." "Yes, sir." "Do you think she could, you know, eh?" "I beg your pardon, Mr. Toots," said Susan, "but I don't hear you." "Do you think she could be brought, you know, not exactly at once, but in time, in a long time, to love me, you know?" "There," said poor Mr. Toots. "Oh dear, no," returned Susan, shaking her head. "I should say never. Never." "Thank ye," said Mr. Toots. "It's of no consequence. Good night. It's of no consequence, thank ye." End of chapter 44.